Good evening. Nice to see you all, and thank you for inviting me to share the podium tonight. I'm a little nervous now that I know the background of the Athenaeum Symposium, this centuries-old chain of wisdom and conversation. I hope I don't break the chain tonight, at any rate. But it's good to be with you. I saw on Google today, here in Montgomery County, one of the most affluent counties in the country, the 10th richest county in the country. You all are represented here tonight. And the #1 county in terms of residents with a postgraduate degree, 29.2%. So I am, by the way, a county is also represented by, I think, one of the most outstanding members of the United States Congress, Chris Van Hollen. So I am proud to be in such esteemed company tonight. And again, thank you for inviting me, Joe. Thanks for your introduction. And I want to pay special tribute to Joan Nake, the director of this Athenaeum Symposium, your former Dean of Humanities here. Joan and Larry I've known since our days together in Sacramento when I was working for Governor Jerry Brown. And they're great friends, have been very helpful to Carol and me as we made our transition from California to Washington, D.C., which wasn't necessarily an easy transition. Joe mentioned I came back here in 1996 to do Crossfire. Crossfire, the first and I think the best of all the debate shows on television. It lasted 19 years until they pulled the plug. Now they're trying to bring it back. I'll let you decide whether it's working or not, the new Crossfire. But the old Crossfire was a lot of fun. I was the only one on the left. And we had a rotating cast of characters on the right, including, of course, Tucker Carlson, but also Bob Novak, the late Bob Novak, Pat Buchanan, Mary Madeline, and John Sununu at one time, Lynn Cheney. You think Dick Cheney's bad? Lynn Cheney is really tough. And I went up against one of them every single night. And people would always say as I'd go around the country, how can you stand being up against Bob Novak, Pat Buchanan, every night? And I used to say, it's very simple. Ted Turner pays me a lot of money. That's sort of the way it worked. But I have to, you got me started here, but my funniest moment on Crossfire, one night, first of all, people always used to say, well, how far in advance do you decide your topics for Crossfire? You know, how many weeks, like, in advance or something, what you're going to talk about that night? And I would have said, you don't understand. You know, we want to be right on the news. We want to be talking about every night, debating every night, what people are talking about in the carpool or at home or that day. And so we never decided the topic until that morning, 9:30 in the morning. And some days it was very clear what you had to talk about. There was just one compelling story. Other days, there was nothing going on. There are a lot of days like that, believe me, in the news business, having to fill 3 hours every morning, I can tell you. So this one day was one of those days. We were on our conference call, Pat Buchanan and I, he was on the show that night, and with me, nothing going. So we said, well, let's just let it float for a while, see what happens. And I went online, and I saw a story out of Kansas City where the Kansas City City Council had decided that they were going to broadcast on cable television every night the names and the faces of men who'd been arrested for prostitution the night before. So their careers were destroyed. There was they had not really been charged yet. They had certainly not had a chance to defend themselves in court or been found guilty, but their faces were already plastered on television. So I thought there were certain maybe right of privacy questions that we ought to discuss. So I called the producer. Pat thought this was a great topic. We decided we're going to talk about that, and the producers got to work getting a guest. She called back in about, our lead producer, in about a half an hour and said, we have our first guest, Dr. Jerry Falwell. All right, we're halfway there. So she says, now, who do you think we should get on the other side? And just being the smart ass that I am, I said, I don't know, how about a prostitute? So So her first question is, where do I find a prostitute? I said, all right, stop, I don't know. But then I had an idea. In San Francisco, where I just come from, there is an organization called Coyote. Cast off your old tired ethics. That's the acronym, Coyote. It's actually like a union for prostitutes. And we got the head of that union as our next guest on us. Well, I have to tell you, first of all, just to see Jerry Falwell and this prostitute side by side was worth the price of admission, because she really looked the part, flaming red hair, red lips, the whole thing. So the way it worked on Crossfire, we got one question and then two follow-ups, and then the next person went. That was sort of our rule. Believe it or not, for those who remember that show, there were some rules they usually existed in violation. So Pat went first that night. Pat's first question, so you are a prostitute? And she said, well, I'm not going to admit that I break the law on national television, but I'm not going to lie either. And I thought, well, that was kind of, we knew what her answer was. That was a pretty political answer. And Pat said, well then, let me ask you, have you always been a prostitute? And she said, no. And Pat says, this is a second follow-up now. Well, what was your profession? What were you before you became a prostitute? And she said, well, I was a Los Angeles police officer. Now, if you're counting, Pat's got his first question, his first follow-up, his second follow-up. It's my turn, but I could see Pat was dying to ask that next question. So I just held back, and Pat said, why did you change jobs? And she said, I thought I needed a more noble profession. Show was over. Jerry Falwell was ready to rip his microphone off and get out of there, but it was a magic moment. I mentioned that Joan and Larry were very helpful in our transition to Washington, D.C., which I said was difficult because Washington is, and more difficult today perhaps, because Washington has changed so much, which is one I wanted to talk a little bit about and then get your questions. You know, Washington really, for much of our history, used to be the place where dreams were made, where change came from, where the American agenda was shaped and created and promulgated and followed. And that's not the way it is today. I mean, everybody, I think, on the right and on the left, accepts the fact today that Washington isn't working. Washington is broken. So I suggested to Joan, we talk a little bit tonight about, can anybody save Washington? And I have to tell you, I think the one-word answer is no. But I'll be, maybe at the end, a little more hopeful than that. Let's start with the Congress. And by the way, I remind every time I think of Congress, I think of Mark Twain, who said, let's suppose you are an idiot. Let's suppose you're a member of Congress. But I repeat myself. Certainly, Republicans in Congress today can't fix what's wrong with Washington for one good reason. They don't want to. They could, they don't want to. And the reason is because so many of them, a good 60 of them, which is not the majority, but it's a very powerful minority, so-called Tea Party members of Washington came to Washington to shut it down. They hate government. They ran on an anti-government platform, and they came here with their agenda is to shut it down. Now, the scary part about that is that these Tea Party members, and Joe and I were just talking about this, were elected because Democrats were asleep at the switch in 2010. They didn't do a very good job electing Democratic governors or Democratic members of the legislature. And in many states, red states, they were able to redraw the district lines, or what's called reapportionment, making some districts very, very safe Democratic districts, but a lot of districts unbelievably safe Republican districts where you can be as far right as you could possibly be and never lose an election. And also, those districts remain that way, and you'll never get these people out. So there are about 60 of them whose agenda really is to shut down the government, and they represent people like, I remember Donna Shalala, who's now the president of the University of Miami, told me when Hillary Clinton first proposed universal health care, and they went out to Oklahoma and they were having a big town meeting about universal health care, and one woman stood up and said, "I don't care what you do, just keep the government out of my Medicare." And Donna told me we should have maybe listened to her because there was something starting right around the country. So these people really do have a visceral hatred of government, and that is and those people in Congress now have really made it almost impossible to get anything done. It didn't always be that way. It used to be people, both sides would campaign, come to a campaign year, and they would go out and fiercely support their candidates, fight like hell to get elected. And then when it was over, winners and losers, both sides would sit down at the table and say, okay, now what are the challenges facing this country? How can we work together to solve those problems? It used to be that way. It isn't that way anymore. Now we are in full-time campaign mode. They never stop raising money. They never stop campaigning. They never have any interregnum, if you will, to sit down and solve problems. It started with Newt Gingrich when he was Speaker. Newt Gingrich actually put out a list of words. He gave all of his members, Republican members of the caucus, a list of words. These are the words you use when you talk about Republicans. There's a long list. It includes words like family, freedom, hard work, patriot, prosperity, truth. Here are the words you use when you talk about Democrats: greed, shallow, incompetent, betray, traitor, lie. Now, there are like 50 words on each of these lists, just a few of them. But you can see the tone that set. But even with Gingrich, you could get things done. It's really worse than that today, and because the feelings, I guess, have become so much more intense. And also because they're following today what is called the Hastert Rule. There isn't no such thing as a Hastert Rule. It's sort of invented, but Denny Hastert, the last speaker. So this is a little bit of math, which I'm sure you could follow. Here is why those 60 Tea Party Republicans I was talking about have such an impact in blocking everything in Congress. There are 435 votes in Congress. Members, you need 218 to get anything passed. The Hastert Rule says, as John Boehner articulates it, unless the majority of the majority agree on anything, we will not bring it up for a vote. So you're left with 235 Republicans. You have to get a majority of the majority. According to the Hastert Rule, you have to get 218 votes out of 235 Republicans, or they won't even vote on it. Now, you subtract 60 from 235, you're never going to get to 218. That's the Hastert Rule, and that's what they have invoked. The result is, of course, this do-nothing Congress. The do-nothing Congress started, we first heard that term back in 1948 when Harry Truman was never expected to get reelected, but Harry Truman went out and ran against the Congress, called it the do-nothing Congress, and lo and behold, he beat Tom Dewey and got elected. Well, people always talk about the do-nothing Congress. Let me tell you something. In 1948, the do-nothing Congress was pretty damn hardworking and got a lot done. We are now in the 113th Congress. That was the 80th Congress. The 112th Congress, it's a 2-year period, so we're in the second year of the 113th Congress. The 212th Congress had the worst record of any Congress in history. The year 2013 had the worst record, was the worst single year of any of the history of the United States Congress. And it looks like this 113th Congress is going to beat the record of the 112th. Now, to give you some numbers, that 80th Congress in 1948 passed this is the do-nothing Congress that Harry Truman ran against, passed 906 bills. So far, this 113th Congress has passed 49 bills. All right, you talk about do nothing. And by the way, if you look at them, most of those are renaming post offices or creating commemorative coins for various occasions, right? So there's really nothing getting done, with very, very few exceptions. It got so bad, by the way, I don't know whether you saw this the other day, that John Boehner said you could have a bill declaring Mother Teresa a saint, and if you attached it to the move to lift the debt ceiling, you couldn't get it passed among Republicans. You couldn't get 218 Republicans to vote for it. That's bad. That's how bad it's gotten to be. And on top of that, by the way, is the other factor, big factor is, on top of the math, and on top of this government, hatred of government, is a visceral hatred of Barack Obama, of people who just don't accept Barack Obama as a legitimate president of the United States. Just one example, Representative Kerry Bentivolio from Michigan the other day, Tea Party from Michigan, the Tea Party Republican from Michigan, said that he was in a room with President Obama and he wanted to run out of the room. He couldn't even stand being in the same room with Barack Obama. I mean, he's president of the United States. I was at the White House today. I was in a room with Barack Obama. I was there with President Hollande and President Obama for the news conference. This is all right. You know, it wasn't bad. I've been in rooms with George Bush and Ronald Reagan and you name it. I mean, the president of the United States. But that's, again, it's that visceral hatred, which really, you add that to the math, you add that to the Tea Party, you add that to the anti-government thing, and you can see why you don't get anything done. And by the way, I wrote a whole book about this. Joe mentioned that copies will be available for anybody who'd like to pick up one afterwards, called The Obama Hate Machine. Now, I want to stop right there for just a second, because I didn't come to give a Democratic Party approach to what's happening, because the Democrats also share some of the blame, and so does President Obama. But I do have to point out, it is not right to say in the Congress that both parties are equally responsible. It's simply not true. And don't take my word for it, because I'm a former chair of the California Democratic Party, so you might think I have some bias in this. This is the best book about Congress that's out there, by the two people who know Congress best, Norm Ornstein from the American Enterprise Institute, conservative think tank, and Thomas Mann from the Brookings Institute, the liberal think tank. It's called It's Even Worse Than It Looks. Came out last year. Let me just read one paragraph. These are two objective people looking at Congress. However awkward it may be for the traditional press and nonpartisan analysts to acknowledge, one of the two major parties, the Republican Party, has become an insurgent outlier, ideologically extreme, contemptuous of the inherited social and economic policy, scornful of compromise, unpersuaded by conventional understanding of facts, evidence, and science, and dismissive of the legitimacy of its political opposition. When one party moves this far from the center of American politics, it is extremely difficult to enact policies responsive to the country's most pressing challenges. Norm Ornstein and Tom Mann wrote an op-ed piece for the Washington Post, April 2012. We've been studying Washington politics and Congress for more than 40 years, and never have we seen them this dysfunctional. In our past writings, we have criticized both parties when we believed it was warranted. Today, however, we have no choice but to acknowledge that the core of the problem lies with the Republican Party. And it's not the entire Republican Party. There are Republicans there who want to get things done still. They're getting fewer and fewer in number. But because of that math, because of the Hastert rule, the Tea Party does rule. And it's making it just about impossible to get anything done. The result, of course, is that if you look at the polls about Congress, the last one I saw from the Public Policy Polling Group, 9% approval rating for the United States Congress. 85% unfavorable rating for the United States Congress. 9%. Traffic jams are more popular. than the United States Congress. Cockroaches are more. There are STDs that are more popular than the United States Congress today, and that's really good. So Republicans can't do it and won't do it, but neither can Democrats. Unlike Republicans, most of the Democrats do want to get things done, but they can't because they simply don't have enough votes. And with the Hastert rule, they are not able to use the votes that they have even to get things done. And the way that works, for example, if you look at it, let's just talk about tonight, right? They passed the debt ceiling tonight. I don't even know that. A clean debt ceiling. No conditions. The vote was about like 221 to 201. It happened while I was on my lovely commute to Montgomery College tonight. So I don't have it exactly. I think it was about 221. But most of those votes came from Democrats. The only things that have passed the House in the last 2 years, the budget deal just before the beginning of the year, the student loan fix last year, reopening the government last year, and the farm bill, and then tonight's debt ceiling thing. The only things that have passed the House have been when John Boehner has agreed to let the entire House vote. And then you have enough Democrats and at least a few Republicans who will vote for it. You can get things done. It's the only way they've been able to get things done. It's just that Boehner won't do it often enough. Minimum wage, like that, if they let the entire House vote on it. Immigration reform, votes are there if they had a vote of the entire House. Extending unemployment insurance, votes are there if they had a vote of the entire House. But they don't. You can see how the Democrats are stymied there, so you really can't count on the Democrats to fix it in the House. And in the Senate, it's another mathematical problem because because with the filibuster, which has been abused and abused and abused and abused, but it is used today in an abusive fashion to block everything, you need 60 votes. You need 60 votes to get to a vote, right? So you can't even vote unless you first get 60 votes. And there are 53 Democrats and 2 independents. So they need 5 Republicans just to have a vote. For example, again, extending unemployment insurance, there are 51 votes for it, but they can't get to the point where you can have 51 vote for it because you can't get over the 60 vote threshold. Last Thursday, they had another attempt to extend unemployment insurance for those people who've been unemployed, long-term unemployed, they're called, for the last 6 months, for more than 6 months. They got 59 votes. Robert Portman, who had voted for it before, wouldn't vote for it, would not give them the 60th vote, so they couldn't even have a vote to extend unemployment insurance. So the math works against Democrats in the House, certainly, like I'd say against the American people, in the House and in the Senate as well. And summing up on Congress, I think the difference is this, and I come back to these Tea Partiers and the reapportionment. The difference is why they're there, why they ran for office in the first place, what they came to Washington to do. And you don't come expecting to get everything done on your side. You don't, Democrats shouldn't and Republicans shouldn't. But you do come to say, for the time that I'm there, I'm going to try to make this a better country for my kids and my grandkids and all the American people. Henry Waxman, one of the most effective members of Congress ever, announced a couple of weeks ago from California, Beverly Hills, been there 40 years. He's a Watergate baby, elected in 1974. He announced that he was retiring. And part of the reason, he said, was because he was just disgusted with the way Congress is today. And he said at the time, when he said he was retiring, I first ran for office because I believe government can be a force for good in people's lives. I think that kind of wraps it up. That says it all, you know? And I'd add that if you don't believe that, you shouldn't run for Congress in the first place. And if you don't believe that and you're in Congress today, then get the hell out and go home, you know, whatever, you know, open up a sub shop or something. But, you know, don't waste our time, taxpayers' dollars, on just blocking things. So if we can't count on Republicans in Congress and can't count on Democrats in Congress, who else? How about President Obama? Well, I hate to tell you, he can't fix it either. Now, it's not because Washington. It's not because he doesn't want to. He really does. Even Bill O'Reilly said his heart's in the right place. Okay, so, you know, at the Super Bowl. But the problem is, and we're learning a little bit about limits in presidential, even in presidential power. And it's not because Obama hasn't tried. Let me tell you, I criticize him a lot because in the first couple of years, I think he just went out of his way. He really thought he could reach across the aisle. He'd only been there 2 years, so he had made a lot of friends on the Republican side. He hadn't become known as a arch lefty Democrat. He thought he could be the first post-partisan president. And I'll tell you how long that lasted, or how soon he should have learned that wasn't going to work. Robert Gibbs told us the story at the White House. Remember, he walks into office and he finds out we're in a deep, deep economic hole. So they came up with this so-called stimulus plan, $787 billion. He called Speaker Boehner and he said, I think this is a way out. I want to come up to the Hill, meet with the Republicans in the House, and lay this out and see if there's some way we can compromise on this. And John Boehner said, Mr. President, welcome. I mean, for a president to go to Congress, up to the Hill, and sit down in their office and meet with them is extraordinary. Most presidents would never do it, and most have never done it. John Boehner said, Mr. President, you're welcome. Before he got in the car to go to Capitol Hill, John Boehner held a news conference and said the Republicans were going to vote no on the Obama stimulus plan. That's the kind of cooperation that he got from all of those meetings that he had with Republicans. Now, the president has said now he's going to use his pen, he's going to use his phone. He realizes that there's very little that he can get through Congress. And it's good, I think, that he can do as much as he can by executive order. Some big things have been done by executive order. Harry Truman ended segregation in the military by executive order. But it's still limited. For example, immigration reform I mentioned earlier. One of the first priorities one of the most serious problems facing this country, it's a priority for President Obama. It's a priority for I think for all Democrats. It's a priority for some Republicans. Why? Because they see that they're losing ground on the Latino vote, which is the fastest growing segment of the American electorate today. George Bush got 44% of the Latino vote in 2004. Mitt Romney got 27% in 2012. Lindsey Graham, Republican senator from South Carolina, says that Republicans are in a demographic death spiral unless they find a way to lead on immigration reform and reach out to the Latino community. So there are a lot of Republicans who want to do this, but there are also enough Republicans who say, we don't need this in 2014. We're running for re-election as Tea Party members, and our Tea Party members don't like brown people. So we don't think we should do anything about immigration reform in 2014. And again, so there will not be a vote on it in the House. John Boehner has announced that. So what can the president do? He can extend he already did what's so-called DREAM Act, meaning providing a path to citizenship for kids who were brought here illegally by their parents. He did that by executive order, but he cannot do comprehensive immigration reform. He cannot resolve the problem of 11 million plus people here living in the shadows by executive order. That's going to take an act of Congress. So we have seen limits on the presidency when you have one party in Congress that just says, we are not going to cooperate. We're not going to do anything. We're not going to support anything that President Obama is for, even stuff that we supported before. In fact, I'll tell you, since I've been here in Washington, the best plan for immigration reform was the plan of President, in my view, with President George W. Bush. And President Obama has put forth basically the same plan. But it was Republican talk show hosts who shot down George Bush's plan, and now it's the Tea Party Republicans who are shooting down the same plan because President Obama supported it. And even some of those Republicans who supported the Bush plan are opposed to the same plan because it has President Obama's name on it now. So some people say, well, you know, the president has to do more schmoozing. I think the president should do more schmoozing. I think he ought to play golf with more Republicans and invite them over to the White House. I don't think, frankly, he does enough of that. But it doesn't always work. I just have to tell you. The president had a screening of the film Lincoln at the White House. Now remember, Lincoln is the founder of the Republican Party. And it was a great movie. And he invited all kinds of members, Republicans and Democrats, come down to the White House for a screening. Not one Republican showed up. John Boehner, Mitch McConnell, they had other things to do. Last Friday, the president flew to Lansing, Michigan to sign the Farm Bill. The Farm Bill, a bipartisan bill. They finally got together on something. Republicans and Democrats, they did it. They proved that you can come together and work on something and get something done. He invited all the Republicans who worked on the bill and all the Democrats who worked on the bill to hop on Air Force One and to fly to Lansing, Michigan with him for the signing ceremony. Not one Republican accepted his invitation. Not one. Thad Cochran from Mississippi said, well, I didn't go because it's such a long way out and back. On Air Force One! I mean, that's the best of all the goodies that you can give as president, a trip on Air Force One. So I just want to make the point that the schmoozing doesn't always work either. So when you realize that not Republicans in Congress, not Democrats in Congress, not even the President of the United States, okay, how about the Supreme Court? The Supreme Court's going to save us, right? Not this court. Not this court. Because they have their own agenda, this particular court. And part of their agenda was to put in place the second worst decision in the history of the Supreme Court, Citizens United. Joe and I were just talking about that. Second only to Plessy v. Ferguson, which approved slavery in this country. Citizens United, don't get too deep in the weeds here, but what Citizens United, January 2010, said that corporations, it reaffirms something that's existed a long time, that corporations are people. But what it said was, therefore, corporations can give as much money as they want to political candidates. No limits whatsoever. This is not what came before the court. What came before the court was a simple little case about a movie on Hillary Clinton that was put together by a group called Citizens United with corporate money. And they wanted to show it during the 2008 campaign, and somebody challenged that little movie. It went to the court, and John Roberts said, you know what, I don't want to just talk about this little movie. Let's talk about all corporate contributions. And he sent the lawyers back and said, come back in 3 months and let's have a great big debate about corporate contributions, because he knew what he wanted, which was to get rid of all limits on corporations. And let me show you what that has meant. For example, more money than ever before in political campaigns, more corporate money than ever before in political campaigns. The Koch brothers, Charles and David Koch, if you don't know who they are, buy my book, The Obama Hate Machine. Look them up, Google them. Koch brothers alone raised and spent $400 million in 2012 on Senate and House races. In 2006, before Citizens United, $60 million was spent across the board in congressional races. $60 million from outside groups, meaning not a Democratic Party committee or a Republican Party committee, outside groups. $60 million in 2006. In 2012, $900 million. Thank you, John Roberts. So you're not going to, just one final point on that. You know, the whole theory behind this is that the conservatives on the court really believe that the principle that money is free speech, which I just think is absurd if you think about it. I mean, we're not equal when it comes to money. We are equal when it comes to speech. You know, rich or poor, you can stand in front of the White House and say whatever you want, or stand in front of the Congress and say whatever you want. We all share that. We all are equal when it comes to speech. We are not equal when it comes to the size check we can write. Isn't it obvious, right? And the ones who write the bigger checks don't stand in front of the Congress expressing their views. they're invited in, right, into the inner chambers and to express their views, and they're the ones whose phone calls are returned. So to me, this idea of getting rid of all campaign contributions simply means we will have the best government that money can buy, and it's getting more and more that way. I think the only answer is to get rid of campaign contributions and go to public financing of campaigns, and we're going to be fighting a lot of these battles until we get there. I want to leave time for questions, so I'm going to move on. We can't count on Republicans in Congress, Democrats in Congress, or the president, or the court, in my opinion, the Supreme Court. Certainly we can trust the media to fix things. As a member of the media, let me tell you, no, you can't either. For a whole lot of reasons, right? I mean, quickly, for one thing, the media is in trouble today financially. You read about this. Newspapers are going broke. They're shutting down bureaus around the world, in Washington, in the state capitals. They're just not covering as much anymore. That means there are not as many reporters on the ground. That means particularly investigative reporters. So what you get is, instead of people going out and doing really good, hard stuff and digging up stories on their own, they just rip and read. You know, they'll get a news release and they rewrite it and put it in the paper. Or watch the news. You see how many of it is just a politician at a news conference saying something. They just cover the news conferences and then, you know, edit it down a little bit. That's not news. That's not a story. That's just giving the politicians free publicity. And then the media is so much, I call it the tabloidization of the media today. You know what I'm talking about. They really love scandals. They much rather talk about a scandal, particularly a sex scandal, than any serious issue, right? They love horse races, the media knows horse races. I mean, we're already talking every day. There's a poll out about Chris Christie or Hillary Clinton. Give me a freaking break. You know, I don't give a shit about 2016 right now. I care about 2014. But that's the media's into this horse race business. They love that, you know, and it's crazy. And also the media has, have you noticed the attention span of a gnat? Right? I mean, it's glob onto one story, whatever it is, and it'll be wall to wall for 24 hours. And then it disappears. Whatever happened? Well, something else came along, right? That is wall to wall something else in these stories. Now, to a certain extent, I think they're reflecting the American people, but I don't think they're serving, really, not entirely. I don't think they're really serving the American people. But it is true, only 2% of the American people watch the evening news, right? That's why we have only a half hour. Think about that. The 3 networks, only a half hour of evening news in this country, because only 2% of the people care enough about it to watch the evening news. Most Americans today get their news from cable television. That's scary. 66% of Americans who get 66% of those who get their information from cable news get it from Fox News. That's even more scary. Fox getting twice as many viewers as CNN and MSNBC combined, right? And more people, it's very close to cable news today, is people getting the news from the internet, you know, which I think is great. I'm online all day long. But, you know, a lot of the internet is unfiltered. A lot of the internet is unedited. And most of the internet sites are slanted one way or this way. It's not the true delivery of the news that you come to expect from a great newspaper, for example, or a great newscast. So when you get down to it, you've got, in my judgment, a broken system that can't be fixed by the Congress, Republicans or Democrats, or the president, nor the Supreme Court, nor the media. So it's totally hopeless, right? I don't think so. I think there's somebody left in the equation that we tend to forget about, and that's where the hope that I see, which is you and me, the American people. Ultimately, think about it. We haven't done our job either, right? Too many of us don't register to vote. Not enough of us actually do vote. Not enough of us follow the news. Not enough of us are active in our communities and get involved in issues or causes or with organizations, whether it's putting a new stop sign near a school or electing somebody who's going to do a better job in Congress. And I'd say not enough of us raise hell, maybe the way we used to. But it's very serious because ultimately we are the ones that have the responsibility, right? You know, we can bitch about the do-nothing members of Congress, but we put them there. You know, we can complain about the longest war in our history, the war in Afghanistan, which has dragged on for 10 years, hopefully will be over this year. But what did we do to stop it before the president just said, I'm going to pull the troops back? I mean, I started out in politics marching in the marches against the war in Vietnam in San Francisco, the People's Park March. We stopped that war in Vietnam. Americans didn't do anything to stop the war in Iraq or the war in Afghanistan. Nothing. No demonstrations in the street. Basically, just kind of look the other way. We complain. This is an important issue to me: gun control and gun safety. Yeah, we complain about the power of the NRA, but what have we done as an American people to organize a force strong enough to outdo the NRA? We outnumber them. You know, after Newtown, Connecticut, 95%, maybe 90%, I don't exaggerate, but 90% of the American people supported background checks on every purchase of every gun. And the NRA represents that 10% at most, and they were able to block it. And what did we do? We said, oh, damn, we didn't get it done again. I mean, it's outrageous. Didn't raise the money, didn't do the organization, didn't do the work, didn't do the legwork. We should have filled the mall with people in front of that Capitol who said, you've got to do this. But we didn't. The NRA filled the halls of Congress with their lobbyists, and they got it done. So we are ultimately responsible. And I don't think that there will be any real change until we are willing to get off our collective asses and get things done. Change is only going to come when we, the American people, get angry enough, fed up enough, pissed off enough, determined enough to mobilize, to strategize, to organize around these issues, to take to the streets again, to fill the city halls and the state legislatures and the halls of the Congress and demand change. It's like that great film Network and Howard Beale getting so fed up that he screamed, I'm mad as hell and I'm not going to take it anymore. So we've got to say, I think, we're mad as hell. We're not going to take it anymore. And until we do, I think we will be kind of whistling past the graveyard and watching things get worse and not seeing any change and not doing anything about it. Which is, finally, the point made by my favorite poet, Charles Bukowski. I love Charles Bukowski, and I've always wanted to quote him in a speech. I collect his work. I have many signed copies of Charles Bukowski. I've never been able to quote him before because most of his poems are unquotable in public. It's too many of them. But I found one that fits. This is a little poem by Bukowski called Democracy. And I'll close with this. The problem, of course, isn't the democratic system. It's the living parts which make up the democratic system. The next person you pass on the street, multiply him or her by 3 or 4 or 30 or 40 million, and you will know immediately why things remain non-functional for most of us. I wish I had a cure for the chess pieces we call humanity. We've undergone any number of political cures, and we all remain foolish enough to hope that the one on the way now will cure almost everything. Fellow citizens, the problem never was the democratic system. The problem is you. Charles Bukowski. Thank you for listening. Good to be with you. Thank you. Well,
Do you think we need to send Justin Bieber back to Canada? No.
By the way, they spent more time talking about that on CNN than they talked about the Farm Bill.
If you were given unlimited power to change one thing in the Constitution, you didn't have to have votes or anything. You just go king for a day. You could do one thing that would solve most of our problems. What would it be?
I would support a constitutional amendment introduced by Bernie Sanders and Nancy Pelosi, which would ban corporate contributions to political campaigns. Ban corporate and individual. Get rid of campaign contributions and institute public financing. It's out there. It's going to be very tough to get the votes. But I think getting the money out of the system, that special interest money, if you will, out of the system would be the single best thing we could do. Short of a constitutional amendment, I was asked this question on the show the other day, and they said, just is there anything you could do that you would suggest that might make things work better? And I said, yeah, there's just one little thing I would suggest. Not a great big thing, just one little thing I could suggest, which is I would throw every single member of the House and Senate out and start from scratch and elect a whole new bunch. Now, you get rid of some good people that way, too, Republicans, Democrats, but I think a clean House would be a great start. Hi.
Thank you for speaking with us. You had really insightful perspectives. I
Thank
appreciate
you.
them.
Yeah.
Talking about money in the system, though, I just had a curiosity on you said there was a projected 11 million illegals in the shadows of America. And I'm just curious because they have to work, and all of our jobs in America require Social Security numbers, which means they have fake ones. Those fake ones, we take taxes out of their paycheck every month, and it goes somewhere to the IRS, right? And it's inside that building, and they never claim this money. What happens to it? Does it just disappear, or do we embezzle it, which incentivizes not allowing illegals to ever become American citizens because we have this huge pile of money that gets hidden away and never talked about anymore?
No, it's a good question. You're absolutely right. I mean, and there's several aspects of that. One is, which is not to be overlooked, is the fact, as you point out, that these 11 million people living in the shadows today, the great majority of them have been here a long time. They're members of our community, they're members of our churches, their kids go to schools. They are paying taxes. They're paying sales tax, right? And they're paying the Social Security tax if they have a job, and most of them do, right? So they are contributing members of our society already, which is why I think it's important to recognize them as such, and not just treat them as outlaws or criminals and think that we're just going to send them all back. I mean, it's just not going to happen. Ronald Reagan, by the way, was the first president to recognize that. There were 5 million living here illegally at the time he was president. And he said, you know what the word he used for dealing with this? We should give them, this is Ronald Reagan's word, amnesty. If you said amnesty today in the Republican Party, you'd be thrown out of the party. This shows how far to the right the party has gone. But directly to your question, that money goes into the U.S. Treasury and is paying for the war in Afghanistan and the war in Iraq. And right, these people are not going to collect Social Security from it. They're also not going to get the coverage under Obamacare. But there are other incentives for them to stay here, just because this is a great country with great opportunities, and their kids get the education, and they certainly want to stay here and don't want to go back. But we're stealing that money from them, in effect.
I wonder if you can care to comment on the role of organized religion in politics.
Well, the third thing I would do in terms of my magic solutions would be to get religion out of politics. Now, I think one of the greatest things we have going for us in this country is the separation of church and state. And one of the most dangerous things happening is too many people want to break down that wall and mix the two. But don't get me wrong. Joe did not mention where I really started. I started studying for the priesthood, which I did for 10 years, actually, before I got involved in politics. So I consider myself a person of faith, and I would hope that everybody's faith would, and I certainly respect those who don't belong to any faith or whatever, but those people of faith, I would hope their faith would influence their political decision-making. But to wear religion on your sleeve, which particularly the Christian right does, and to suggest that their faith dictates public policy and what this country has to do is simply wrong. We are not a Christian country. Our founding document is not the Bible. It's the Constitution of the United States, and I think people of all faith live under that. We'd be better off and reserve the religious ceremonies to places of religion and not to the United States Capitol. I'd even get rid of the prayer that opens the sessions of Congress. There's some things, we kind of tolerate, like in God we trust in our coins. I mean, I think that's wrong, but I'm not going to spend my life fighting that one, right? But the influence, particularly, it was waning for a while, of the Christian right. The Jerry Falwell days was very strong, then it sort of went down, but now it's coming back up again. It troubles me.
Thank you for your comments. I really enjoyed it. I
Thanks.
really enjoyed the conclusion where you said the problems with American people, and when you were saying it's kind of obvious that the further down we go, Congress becomes more polarized and quarrelsome. So my question to you is, what one virtue or characteristic do you think our generation lacks, which previous generations had, to not vote such, I don't know, poor people into Congress?
Maybe anger, maybe fight. I mean, maybe you have it too easy. It's a very good question. I just remember when I was in my 20s and in San Francisco, just getting out of the seminary, there was no way I could not be in the street marching against the war in Vietnam. I felt that passionately about it. There's no way. And when Gene McCarthy, my first campaign was Gene McCarthy for president in 1968. When he jumped in against Lyndon Johnson, the war in Vietnam, and then the next day, I was teaching school. The next day, I was in the McCarthy headquarters volunteering, and I worked there almost full-time as a volunteer all the way through. And I wasn't the only one. I mean, there were, just an army of young people who, on their own, went out and volunteered. They felt that strongly about it. Now, what motivated us to do it? We had our core beliefs, but you have your core beliefs too. I guess political action, just more a part of our fiber and more a part of our core. And you need somebody. The other thing is, I mentioned McCarthy. We had people who inspired us to do that too. Gene McCarthy, Bobby Kennedy. And I never saw crowds in American politics the size of the crowds for McCarthy and Bobby Kennedy until Barack Obama in 2008. And he inspired a lot of young people to come out too. So maybe it's, you haven't had the same kind of influences that we did. I remember marching in San Francisco alongside of Pete Seeger in the marches against Vietnam. And you talk about somebody who inspired you to get out. And we also smoked a lot of pot. Maybe that was it. But so don't accept the fact that you're different. Just get out there, and there are lots of ways you can contribute.
I was going to start with a question, but you bring up a good point, and I actually have a good theory on that.
Good. You can answer his question. Yeah.
I don't know how many of you guys saw Bowling for Columbine.
Yeah.
Remember Matt Stone's interview? He's describing to Michael Moore the fear. I'm 20 years old, and I remember going through school and watching it the first time, thinking how brilliantly he captured it when he's talking about the rhetoric of the counselors, the principals, the teachers telling you, you got to study. 11 years old, sixth grade. You got to study for this test to get into honors math in sixth grade. Because if you don't get into honors math in sixth grade, you won't get into honors math in seventh grade, and then not eighth or ninth or 10th and 11th or 12th grade, and then you'll just die poor and lonely. And that's it. And the fear, I don't know if it's, because the population's growing or the world's getting more competitive, but yeah, that's very much the rhetoric I felt in school too. This, get the grades, get into college, make money, men don't lose your hair, women don't gain weight, just look out for yourself. And that lack of community, which brings me to my next question.
But I want to say, I wish I had been there at the time, because I would have told you the most important lesson I learned in college, which is don't let your studies interfere with your education. And a friend of mine told me that freshman in college, and boy, I never forgot it, and I took full advantage of it.
So here's my question for you. Do you think America's ready for Jon Stewart as president?
Well, I'll tell you one thing. He's got the best news show on television, I think. He's just phenomenal. Yeah. I don't know whether you saw him last night talking about Michael Sam, and his take on it was just great. So,
and
another question? Yes.
It is, the ID laws are more tough now. It is harder to get drugs or to get drugs underage like pot. So maybe that's part of the problem too.
Well, I was of age when I was smoking pot, but it was illegal. So it didn't matter what age I was, right? Yeah.
No, my question to you, I like what you said about the media, about that's like the avenue for the American people to really know what's going on and to perhaps, make them feel empowered to do something about it, as opposed to being lectured on high by, rich representatives who make 10 times as much as they do.
Right.
But
here, go ahead. Yeah.
So what do you do now to, this is 2014, there's hundreds of different websites. How, even someone like me who's intrinsically encouraged to be informed, how do you weed through the foxes? And
Okay, good. No, excellent question. Here's what I would say. The media is there. You have to make it work for you, right? Again, you really have to put as much energy into that as anything else, I believe. Look, I have 3 hours a day to fill on radio and television every day, right? So I'm like, my antenna are always going, right? I'm a sponge. I need to know everything I need to know because I got all this time to fill. So I'm on like all the sites. And I think you almost, not as much as I do, but you can't depend on any one site. If you just go to, I don't care, Drudge, or you just go to Huffington Post, you're not getting the full picture, particularly online. So I mean, I'll tell you what I do. I go in no particular order to Drudge. I've known Matt Drudge for a long time. I've had dinner together, we're friends, but I don't always agree with it, and he's certainly a far-right slant. I go to Huffington Post. I go to Slate. I go to Politico. I go to Daily Beast. I look at Daily Caller. And then I read the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal and The Nation and the New Yorker and the New York Review of Books. All right, so, I mean, that's like every day, and then other stuff too. So I'm just saying you've got to be, hungry for news, and you can't depend on any one source. And if you get them down, by the way, you can go like a hummingbee, across through the flowers. You don't have to read every damn word of every article. Just go through the headlines and see what looks good to you, what you're interested in. Read that and then move on and get a perspective from someone else. But you got to work at it. You can't just sit back and or depend on any one site. And with technology today, it's pretty easy to do, right? You can do it anywhere. Sir? Yeah.
Good evening. Nice to hear what you're saying.
Thank you.
My question is about racism. And I believe that so much of this hate Obama and the just say no to him, particularly on the part of the Tea Party Republicans, is a veiled racist response. And we see that xenophobia too, when they try to say he was a Muslim and he wasn't born here. I just wonder what other evidence or how much of this situation we're in is this old specter that's haunted this country for so long of racism. That really concerns me. I wonder if what you think about it and what you have seen, you're so close to the center of this, but it's sort of something that doesn't seem to be people want to speak about. But I wonder what your views are on it.
Well, sadly, you're absolutely right. I don't like to say it's all about racism because I don't think it is, but you cannot deny. I believe the Tea Party movement is fundamentally a racist movement. I think the main reason they don't accept Barack Obama is because they just don't accept the fact that there's a black man in the Oval Office. They don't believe, the main reason they want to believe he is not a legitimate president or was not born in the United States is because of the color of his skin. And we see that today. I get it every day in terms of my emails and telephone calls. In your media, you're a target, right? I mean, so if I write something about Obama, I hear from it in response to my columns, and inevitably, the criticism starts with, this guy isn't even a legitimate president. He's not, and he wasn't born in this country. I went to a lot of the early Tea Party rallies. When Glenn Beck had his thing here on the Mall, and his things in Lafayette Park, I used to go to them. And the signs that they had with Obama in whiteface, I mean, they were blatant, outright blatant, racist posters and slogans. I did a column last week, don't guess my column, about, so on the part of yahoos or extremists or these wackos, they've always existed. But today, they are encouraged, I think, by some of the right-wing politicians, which I find very troubling. I wrote in my column last week 3 examples of members of Congress at town hall meetings. The one is a guy from Oklahoma. He was having a town hall meeting, and this woman said, I just can't accept Obama because he's not legitimate. I mean, and I think he ought to be executed. And the congressman just laughed and smiled, right? I mean, as I said, I hope the Secret Service was knocking on her door and his door, right? This Bentifolio I mentioned, who said he can't stand being in the presence of Barack Obama. He was at one of his town hall meetings, and somebody said, if only we could, word for word, impeach this son of a bitch. And Bentifolio's response was, if I could write that bill, that would be my dream come true. Rather than to say, man, look, we may disagree with him, but he's the president of the United States. And let me just say, John McCain, when John McCain, in 2008, if you remember, he was at a forum, and a woman said something about, I just can't stand this guy. I mean, he's an Arab, right? As if that's something wrong with that. And McCain just took the microphone back from him. He said, no, ma'am. He's a good family man. He's a good American. I just happen to disagree with some of his policies. Well, good for John McCain, right? And there are too many today who don't do that. And it starts, I take it all the way up to John Boehner, who last week said when they couldn't get the support for immigration reform, and he said there will not be a bill this year. And he said the reason is not because they couldn't agree. He said the reason is because we cannot trust this president to enforce our laws. Now that encourages that kind of extremism, that kind of racism. So,
Crossfire was a great show,
thank you.
and only you know whether or not the persuasiveness of your opponent helped change your mind on any issues and vice versa. Are there non-negotiables today in politics that we cannot hope people to move away from, and therefore some of this may continue on indefinitely?
I don't think there are non-negotiables. I've never been asked that question, but, and by the way, people can change their mind, right? I remember Pat Buchanan and I used to argue like hell over medical marijuana. Pat supports it today. We used to argue over recognizing Cuba and normalizing relations with Cuba, which is one of the most ridiculous, antiquated policies that we have today. I don't know whether you saw the latest poll, like something like 75% of people in Florida now say that we should normalize relations with Cuba. And we're still not doing it because, you know, we're waiting for Fidel Castro to die. He's not going to die. I'm convinced. He's like Lenin. But I don't think, I think there, I remain an optimist, I guess, and hopeful. I believe no matter the issue, there is, again, not getting 100% of what you want, but there is some way to come together, pardon me, on all of these issues, whether it's climate change or immigration reform or contraception as part of healthcare or abortion, you name the issue. I think it's possible for people who really want to improve the lives of all Americans and make this a better country. I think there's some way for people to come together. And with that spirit, I think you can. But when you start out by saying, we're against anything, therefore, it's a non-starter. Unless, again, I come back to where I ended, unless we just raise so much hell that they have to start acting differently. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.